Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you were able to choose between many different panels at the moment, and I really appreciate and very pleased to see you all here. So my name is Dimitri Shishkin. I'm Digital Development Editor for BBC World Service. And I'm very pleased to be in Perugia for the first time. This is my first time at the festival, and I'm completely bowled over by the event. So I'm chuffed. Thank you. So I am very happy to introduce three panelists. Isabel Rugal from LinkedIn, Federica Cherubini from Condé Nast International, and Scott Lamb from BuzzFeed. And the reason why we wanted to get together and to discuss certain things is that we certainly are a part of a very big trend in international media, where international media are actively going to non-English language markets, and we're all doing it very differently. Some of us are public service organizations, some are platforms, some are big international players, English-based or otherwise, and we just thought that it would be useful for us to all to talk about how we do things, why we do certain things, and then what are the similarities, and crucially, what are the differences? And more crucially, I guess, what kind of things we can learn from each other, and what kind of things we can share with you. So the panel will go like that. So we'll spend about 20 minutes briefly talking, four of us, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion between us, and then roughly the same amount of time for questions from you, okay? So I am very pleased to, Isabel and I have met about a year ago, and LinkedIn is one of those really big companies that currently yet do not necessarily, are not necessarily on the front of the minds of people when it comes to news consumption, but given their reach and given their ability to reach so many people around the world, we thought it would be really great to hear from the experience of LinkedIn. Here you are.
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully after today we will be front of mind. Thank you everyone for coming. So my name is Isabel Rugal. I am international editor at LinkedIn. So started at LinkedIn back in 2012 in Paris, and now lead from London our team of non-US editors. So some of you may not know that we have an editorial team at LinkedIn. We actually have had editors, professional journalists, since 2011. There was like 4 of us when I joined. There's now close to 50 of us on the platform. So that's the countries that I'm going to try to all remember that I'm working with at the moment. So my team is in Brazil, Germany, France, UK, India, China, Australia, and currently hiring to expand in Japan and in Latin America and Spanish. Hiring, by the way, if you're looking. So what the team of editors at LinkedIn does, our mission, which is written up there, is provide professionals with the news and views they need to talk about things that matter. Which, simply put, our role is to ignite smart conversations on LinkedIn. We're looking to create, curate, cultivate content on LinkedIn that's going to help people in their professional life, gives them the news that they need to start their day, their professional day, and grow in their career. And we are doing this, we started this in the US in English, but we are now doing this in 5 languages and on 4 continents. And the reasons that we are expanding internationally is pretty simple. We, as a company, as a platform, we are already present all over the world in 27, 28 languages, as a tool, as a platform. And so our mission as a company is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. You can't do that if you're only doing content in English, which is not the language of every professional on earth. So we'll get there eventually. For now, we have sort of the main languages around the world. So Dimitri asked us to answer kind of 3 basic questions to get us started. The first one is, what's one major challenge that you had to deal with? So what came to mind for me is how to be locally relevant while staying consistent globally. And what I mean by that is when you're expanding internationally, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different markets, a lot of who are going to be in a different place in relation to your company. So for instance, in the case of LinkedIn, if you're looking at the US, UK, Australia, very high adoption rates. Pretty much everyone who has a career has a LinkedIn profile, and people are quite fluent in how to use these platforms. But if you go to Japan, for instance, where we are expanding at the moment, we're much earlier in our story as a company in Japan, and so the people that you're dealing with have a very different notion of who you are. So you want to adapt your strategy to work for all of these people, and at the same time, on top of that, you have the cultural differences, right? So as a content platform, it is in France. I can say this because I'm French. Everyone has an opinion about everything. It's very easy to get people to comment on and create content on a platform. Versus in Germany, where people are going to be a little bit more mindful of privacy, of what they share, and of putting an opinion out there. So you have to adapt your product to work for everyone, being mindful of all these different cultures, while being one brand and being consistent and being. You can't be everything to everyone. So you want to be recognizably you and at the same time relevant to a lot of different people. The next question was one thing I should have known or would have do differently if I started over today. And what I mean by get everyone on board before you take off is we in a couple projects we had a couple false starts, and it was always because I or my team were kind of running ahead and not necessarily looking back to make sure everyone else was coming along. So when you're building an international expansion, you want to make sure that not just editorial is going, but product is going, and you have support in comms and marketing, and everyone is looking in the same direction and has the resources. Even if they want to help you, they also have the resources to all do that together. So now we're very much thinking as one company when we go into a new market, and what is that going to mean for engineering? What is that going to mean for comms, etc.? So we all go in together, and it's far more effective. And that's kind of depends also on what your culture as a company is. In our case, we're fairly flat consensus-based companies. It's not enough to convince the boss. You have to get everyone on board and bought in. And finally, one thing to remember today. So my philosophy is always hire smart people and get out of their way. I think that's our philosophy as a company, but it's extra true when you're going into all these markets, because it doesn't matter how well-traveled and worldly you are, you're never going to know these places as well as the people that you hire. So, I'm going into Japan, I'm going into Australia. Even if I lived in Australia, my Australian editors just know this thing inside and out far better. So my role as a manager, as a leader, is to empower people, get out of their way, just listen to them and let them run with the ideas that they have, and that usually works far better than trying to come up with a solution from headquarters.
Thank you very much, Isabel. We'll get back to some of the questions about locally relevant and globally consistent, because I think it's a theme for us all. So going back to Federica and I have known each other for some time now as well, and the really cool thing that Condé Nast International is doing now is that, again, present in many, many countries, lots of magazines, lots of digital presence, and Federica has a wonderful title. Over to you.
Thank you. I am head of knowledge sharing at Condé Nast International. So I am part of a recently newly formed central team that is tasked to work across all 11 wholly owned Condé Nast companies around the world. So we're present in, so we have like the wholly owned like Mexico, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, UK, Russia, India, Taiwan, Japan, and China.
Well done.
Yes. Yes. And so my role is a bit different from the others on the panel, because everything I do is internal facing. So because we went from a group of very autonomous companies around the world to going to be a much more well-connected network of companies working together. I have spent some time thinking about the ways we work together, the ways we communicate, and specifically we share knowledge, best practice, ideas, contacts, kind of knowing who's who and who's doing what, so that we can all learn from what the others are doing. And I think, similarly to what you said, I think the biggest challenge is probably the balance between global and local. Sitting centrally in London, I need to come up with things, tools that would resonate or being indeed available, and with China in the mix, that's usually a challenge to everyone, that everyone can access, but at the same time, that it needs to be tailored enough to the local needs to not be disruptive. And so, especially because the companies were already there, so it's not, we're expanding in new countries. We have, I think, in 26 markets globally, if you count the licensee. But because the structure was already there, because we have very healthy, strong local companies, is really about the balancing act between what makes sense globally while staying relevant locally. I think one thing I would have done differently, one of the examples is because we were communicating only via emails before, I started rolling out Slack across all the companies. I think Slack is good as many other tools. It's because it's Slack. It's because you need a place and you need a platform where everyone is on and where everyone can talk and connect. And I think that was challenging because we started very organically getting more and more people on board and finding the right way of being flexible and adapt and see what's going on and keep changing while having a real long-term structure of how the tool is gonna work out around the world. And I think if there is one thing that I think is most important from this session, is that it's all about the people. Yes, tools, processes, of course everything is crucial, but at the end of the day it all comes back to the human aspect beyond it. Collaboration is about trust, and it's about awareness and being aware of the similarities, what unites us all, why we're all part of a Condé Nast company, but also what is different, and being mindful and always aware that when you're getting into an audience where, there is no time zone where all our markets are away at the same time. We're not going to solve it. So you need to be mindful of when you're scheduling a meeting or when you're sending out emails, group emails, that's going to impact on people's life.
Right, excellent. So as I am switching from one presentation to another, I'll just tell you a story about how I got to know Scott. So a few years ago, I was just thinking about all other publishers who have international presence, and I thought, well, BuzzFeed obviously is the obvious one. They have lots of international editions, and I just got in touch with Scott on Twitter and just said, well, I'll be in New York, why don't we meet? Because we seem to be doing things which are quite similar. So, Scott, I'm just putting your presentation up. Over to you.
Great. Well, I'll get started as that happens. I put too many animated GIFs, I think, in my presentation, so it's slowing things down. My name is Scott Lamb from BuzzFeed. My title is Vice President of International, which I think is delightfully vague. I'm very vague, broad titles, so I'm okay with that. And my remit is our international operations, focused mostly on editorial, although I have some business responsibilities as well. But I think beside the sort of managerial and operational work that I do at BuzzFeed, I think the kind of core thing in my role and my responsibility is running this process at BuzzFeed. And this process is actually very central, I think, to the way that a lot of things work at BuzzFeed. It's kind of the centerpiece of our DNA, this like continual learning process. We apply that to content, we apply that to advertising. And in my role focused on international, it was about applying that to launching new international initiatives. That could be launching in new countries or bringing brands like Tasty to new places, like Tasty in Brazil. So that's a little bit about what I do. BuzzFeed's presence right now, we have 10 international editions. In the Americas, we're in Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. In Europe, in the UK, well, we're in the UK, and in Europe, we're in Spain, France, and Germany. In Asia Pacific, we're in India, Australia, and Japan. And Japan is the only joint venture that we have. Everything else is owned and operated directly by BuzzFeed. We publish in 7 languages. We'd like to expand it to more. I'm really excited to hear more from Dimitri about the BBC, because I think of them really as the world leader in publishing in many, 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 many different languages. If you're doing the math, in addition to the ones that I've named, we also publish a little bit in Russian. We don't really have an edition there. We have a Twitter channel and a VK page. And I can't really give you the justification for the rationale behind that. It just kind of happened that we started publishing in Russian. To the main 3 questions, I think for me, the biggest, the sort of strategic aim behind BuzzFeed's international expansion was, I think for any digital publication, global growth is one of the advantages of being digital. I think it's much, this is so obvious in 2018 to say, but it's so much easier to expand internationally when your distribution platforms are already global, as Twitter and Facebook and many others are. In addition to that, right from the very beginning, and I think this is true for all digital publications as well, we had an international audience. When I started at BuzzFeed in 2007, most people in New York City had not heard of us, but we did have a small, very small, but very dedicated readership in Australia. And so from the beginning, we had signal that the work that we were doing was reaching audiences overseas. It took us a long time to be able to sort of take that seriously and invest against it, but I think it's an advantage of being a digital publisher. Our strategy has been based around growing these owned and operated properties. We really want to, I think very similarly to some of the other panelists, it's about getting that local and global balance right, but hiring people locally, building teams there, and helping them reach their aims. And those aims are really twofold. They're very obvious. We want to grow an audience, and we want to build a business. I think for me, thinking about things I would have done differently, could I go back and do it all again? I've really been impressed with the way that the New York Times has been approaching their international expansion. They obviously have a very different business model and different aims than BuzzFeed does, but I was really impressed reading on Medium a couple of years ago this post about their approach to their launch in Spanish in Mexico City, and that they did a lot of design research ahead of their launch there. They did a lot of interviews. I could give you a presentation that talks about the very rational, logical strategy that BuzzFeed put together, but it's not totally true. I mean, we make business decisions sometimes based on people or very immediate situations, not always, looking at the long term. And I think for me, I would love for the next thing that we launch to have a much more thorough, building process before we get going. And finally, I think the one thing to remember from today, to get up on my soapbox a little bit, I've heard this a lot. I've said this a lot over the years, but I think this notion that there is sort of one direction for the growth of digital publishing globally is a dangerous and reductive myth. And it usually comes out in the form of like, the US is so far ahead of X country. If you look at the way that things are developing globally, that's just so not true. The US is one of many possible futures for digital media, and I think for people that do work like this, and those in the audience that are interested in international expansion, keeping that bias out of your thinking, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Scott. And one thing to add about your Russian activities, that I was very, very pleased to hear that we were just about to hire a really great social media person for BBC Russian, and then we realized that he joined BuzzFeed. So
sorry about that.
Lots of similarities here. Let me just go back to my presentation now, and then we'll have a chat. Can you put that? Yeah, right. So BBC's international portfolio, which I'm looking after, it consists of 28 sites up until last July, and then we thought, well, we have been publicly funded by the BBC license fee payers, all that portfolio, and our job is as a public service organization to provide independent and impartial news in the world, where in regions where particularly either the local media is too crowded and there is no much sense happening, or the access to news is restricted. And then the government came to us and said, well, why don't you, everybody realizes this opportunity that there is going to be another 1 billion people online, all from developing world and all on mobile phones. So we needed to react to that as well somehow. And the government said, well, why don't you, we are interested in funding more of your expansion. And we this is what we have done. Thank you. This is what we have done. We have launched another 12 sites in the space of 9 months, which probably made it probably the best year in my career, definitely, because we have never done anything like that before, and now we have a portfolio of 40, and I'm also kind of presiding on this enormous digital expansion where we're creating 326 roles globally in all these places. It's an incredibly gratifying job. I always say that I have the best job in world journalism, by all means, but obviously it comes with challenges. So my big challenges is that while launching new teams, I'm also dealing with existing teams, and my job is to turn them around and kind of make them more adaptable. We are a legacy organization of radio, TV, so it's kind of how you find different ways of working between them. And then some BBC technologies just they're not fit for purpose for developing world audiences. You know, pages need to be loading much faster. We are part of the widest BBC portfolio websites, so lots of technology has to be consistent. And if I were to, well, on the basis that I'm a chair of this panel, so I selected 3 things that you need. I would have done differently. Sorry. Yeah, I know completely. I know. I'm just Russian like that. So I think getting service. So one thing which we should have done completely differently when we were launching new teams, we got the service heads of these teams at the same time as the team itself, and that was the wrong thing to do, in my view. You needed to have the leaders of those teams earlier, so they can then impact on the selection of the teams themselves. The second thing was then when HR department was contributing to benchmarking of salaries around the world, they didn't quite realize how separate digital benchmarking and digital salaries around the world are. And for example, in Russia, we haven't yet still hired a developer, for example, because it's just such a sought-after profession there. And then also because obviously this huge expansion, my team is only a team of 15, and it's a digital strategist, practical digital strategist team, and we just should have given ourselves a little bit more muscle to get. And one thing, if you were to remember one thing about the BBC way of looking at expansion, is this slide. This is the most influential slide I saw ever from our audience research department. This is about 6 user needs. So basically, you might have heard this. This has been going around for about a year now. But basically, these are 6 things, according to our audience research teams, that internationally people are expecting from news. And if you see that update me option is only one of 6, but actually if you are going to start satisfying other user needs which are there on the screen, then this is where the audience will come from. So I think as a public service organization, I totally believe in sharing our own research with the rest of the world, and I think that this is a really great thing for other people to know. So that's me. So going straight back into the conversation, I think I am really interested to hear from the 3 of you about how you actually practically sharing information with all your teams around the world. Because if you have been to one of the sessions yesterday where Jenny Barrett from Reuters was saying that she was applauded by her marketing team that the open rates of her email was 10%, because she was sending some stuff, some comms to the people, and only 10% opened it, and she was not very happy with it, but everybody was, and they were saying like amazing. But what do you do? How do you ensure consistency? How do you communicate with people who are around the world, 24 hour time zones and all that? So what are your tips?
It's my title. Okay, I'll start. Well, now after all your slides and all your countries, I can say the only 11 countries that we have. So what my job is about building communities around the company. So as part of the central team, we have data and insight, product, digital development, strategy, editorial, commercial, and they are ultimately the expert, and they own, of course, the areas of expertise. And then they work with the equivalent in all the 11 countries. But before, there was very little need, even from like what the print-led business was organized, was a little need of being in touch constantly and sharing and learning from each other. And so right now, we develop this concept where if you work in data in Japan, you're part of the Condé International data community, you're in touch with everyone else that works in data across the 11 markets. As I mentioned, we have Slack, but Slack is just one touch point and is a tool after all. So we do regular calls where, for example, with the heads of data, we have a monthly call. It's always at the same time of the month and of the week, because when a new central team comes in, you have to be mindful that all your colleagues around the world were already very busy in doing the job, and now you're adding just another layer to talk to each other, and sometimes just there isn't the time. And so we have to do it as easy as possible. And the idea, for example, when we do the calls, which we do 2 calls, by the way, because as I said, no one is awake at the same time. So we do 2 calls, and the central team kind of repeats the same, joins both and repeats the same message. But it's really not about the central team talking to local. It's about them. It's just, I think, of myself as an enabler. I just put together and put in place a system for them to be able to share. We have different topics every month. We have an agenda. We go around the table and everyone mentions either it's like something we're dealing with. We have this concept that I borrowed from one of my colleagues in the UK business of learners and leaders. So, markets varied and the degrees of success in different areas varies, but there is never one market that is better, like the best and the last best or something. Everyone is a learner in an area and everyone is a leader in another area. And so my best job is when I can highlight and leverage the learnings from the markets and sharing within each other.
So just a side note, if you haven't read Federica Niemann's lab predictions for 2018, it's about a bridge roles, which I am in a bridge role connecting things, Fede definitely as well, Isabel as well. So my question, how do you do it back in LinkedIn?
So similarly, we have a lot of, Slack, which sometimes is used for other things than sharing GIFs. We have meetings. So editorially we have about 50 people. So we're still at a scale that is manageable. Though certainly, it was 4 of us when I started, and we've been scaling pretty quickly lately. And so we've thought a lot about how do we maintain our team culture, how do we maintain our communication. So we have sort of regular appointments. So my organization has a monthly meeting, and then one level up with our editor-in-chief, there's a monthly meeting with everyone. One thing that we do is we make sure to alternate the scheduling of those meetings. So one is America's friendly, and then the next month it's APAC friendly. So it's not always the same people having to be up at midnight to attend a meeting, which is really important to keep people happy, and also to just make sure that you don't give the impression that you're an American company that happens to be also in Asia, like that you're really a global company and everyone has kind of equal weight in making things happen. We also make sure that we have opportunities for sharing that are not hierarchical. It's not like some meetings are just really about me disseminating a lot of information to the whole team, but we also have show and tell, where people who've been working on particular projects explain to the whole team what they've been doing and what they learned, what failed, etc. We have a weekly report that we send out not only to the team but to the larger organization. It surprisingly has a really high open rate, and that's where being a journalist really helps, because essentially we write the report the same way that we would write a story, because that's what's going to make people open it internally. And the last thing I would mention is make sure when you expand internationally that you include a travel budget for your team. There is nothing like face-to-face time. My boss is in New York. He's been my boss for 6 years. We have a very close working relationship. We've never actually been in the same office. But just from the moment I started, I was in New York once a quarter to spend a week with the team, and especially if you have remote employees or by themselves far away, that week just charges you up for the entire quarter, keeps you focused, keeps you motivated.
Right, so we just signed off our budget for next year, and all the team members in my team have 3 trips a year, that they need to go. So specialists in social media, specialists in data, in digital video, they all will, their priorities they will decide for themselves, but there is a budget for that. Presumably, Scott, you travel a lot.
I do. So I try to make myself as available in market, minimum once a year and a number of markets a couple of times a year. So I do a lot of traveling, although now have a young family, so I'm trying to back off on that a little bit, which I'm sad to do. But I agree, I think getting people together is probably, in fact, to me, the most important. A lot of the information that we want to share, digital communication lends itself pretty well to that, to share decks and strategy. The component that's is just totally irreplaceable is the cultural one. And I think one of the most effective things I ever did was bring together all of the international editors, take them to a warehouse in Queens and make them walk a tightrope. This was like a circus training thing that you could go and do, like corporate bonding, and they hated it. It was deeply embarrassing. People cried, but it did the thing that team bonding is meant to do. It really brought that team culturally together. In a lot of ways, I've realized over the years that their relationships with one another are much more important in many ways even than their relationships with me. They're going to learn a lot more. They have a lot more to offer each other than I do. And actually, that's a thing I'm thinking about a lot right now, and just in terms of the way that we share things. Just making sure that the centralized team, that the people at headquarters are adding value. I think occasionally we can get very impressed with our ideas and strategy, and we forget that our job is to serve the leaders that we have in other markets. So this year especially, I think we're sort of rethinking the structure of the team, the mission of the team, to make sure that we're really, we're consultants in a way, that we're providing value and helping them achieve their aims, not providing them sort of hoops to jump through or goals that don't make sense to them.
Excellent. So I'll one of the things, because we are such a large organization, and we all languages are divided into 6 regions, so we not only invest in individual teams, but we also invest in the kind of a regional level of digital executives who look after, instead of looking after 60 or 40 teams, they look only after maybe 6 or 5, and then they kind of, so instead of hiring 5 YouTube editors, which we cannot afford to hire for 5 teams, we would hire one who would look after the YouTube activities for 5 teams at the same time. So that helps, but that leads me to actually the question which I wanted to ask. What is the right balance between giving your decentralized teams central content which they are obliged to take, regional content that they might find interesting? For example, I don't know, Brazilians might like something from Mexicans and stuff, and then leaving what is the percentage of their own original stuff that they can do separately. So in our case, it's probably 30-30-30, roughly, kind of, whatever, 33, or maybe thereabouts. But do you oblige, or any of your organizations, do you oblige your federated teams to take something centrally? And yes, or if no, why?
Okay, I'll start with that. We don't require that they do. We expect them to. We hope that it will provide value. And certainly if we look at sort of the content that's running in each market, I think they do get a lot of value out of being able to draw on the work that the team in Mexico or Brazil or Japan are doing. So we have a core team of translation and adaptation editors at BuzzFeed, and their job is literally to do that, to say, all of BuzzFeed content is my playground. I can pull in whatever I want and translate it, adapt it in a way that's going to work for that market. But we don't have a baseline requirement for that. That's really up to them.
We have a central editorial team for Vogue. I realize I didn't mention that Condé Nast International is the publisher of brands like Vogue, GQ, Vanity Fair, Wired, Architectural Digest. So the only central team we have for editorial is Vogue. And if you were this morning a presentation of my colleague Hannah Ray, you've seen how she developed a strategy for the Instagram accounts. So the central team sometimes produce content and sometimes helps find and elevate and encourage syndication amongst the various titles. Sometimes they provide translation when it's needed, but it's very much, there is no mandate to take any content. In some cases, it's just very powerful being able to go and, a brand like Vogue talking on behalf of 11 Vogues around the world gives you access to exclusives and unique content that is otherwise would be really difficult to have. So everything that gets produced centrally is not about mandating the local markets to use. It's an incredible opportunity to be able to pull together the strength of a network and then have additional content. But yeah, the central team has features desk, picture desk, of course, Verg being very visual, sharing photos is different, sharing text. But the idea is surface sometimes the best of content, or sometimes just, it's not about translating or adapting a content, is inspiration for things that could resonate, maybe repackaged differently, but it's ideas and inspiration that could resonate in other markets.
Well, for us, because we're a platform, it's going to be slightly different. So it's not so much the content itself that we're going to share internationally, but it is the elements of the strategy. So we have sort of having been doing this for 7 years now editorially, we've tried a lot of things, and we starting to have a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't, and which gives us a global playbook. And then in each market, we're going to sort of pick and choose different elements based on, what are the particular goals that we're trying to achieve in that quarter, in that market, or what do we know is more likely to work there. So we have a couple central elements to our editorial strategy. One is a daily rundown, which is the sort of daily digest of the top business headlines trending in the professional world that are delivered to our members through the mobile app. So that's something that is created locally in each of the markets, is replicated in different ways. Obviously the news is different. Occasionally we're going to reuse some of the content if you're writing a blurb about a news event that is global. At least between the English language markets, it's easy enough to, rather than rewriting the exact same thing, to just grab from the UK edition to put into US a few hours later. And then we have a franchise which is called LinkedIn Lists, where we use sort of insights from LinkedIn data to tell stories about the economy. So we released most recently our top companies list, which is the most in-demand employers around the world. So that's something that we have different iterations of in all the markets that we're present, because everyone is interested wherever.
Okay. So I apologize to your bosses potentially who might be watching the live stream, but I'm going to ask something which hopefully you'll be comfortable with. But if you were to start from scratch, or what kind of things you would have done differently, and as part of that question, is there anything elsewhere which you admire, would like to take? Lucy Keung yesterday from Reuters Institute was talking about driving digital change in newsrooms, and she was saying that the porous or flexible structures is one of the key to digital success. So all our organizations, small units, are likely to be changing all the time depending on the challenges. So what kind of challenges you are thinking already about? And Scott, you alluded to the fact that you are looking at structures and stuff like that. So I would like to hear from all of you on that.
Great. Yeah, I think two of the points that you actually mentioned in your slide, I think if I could go back in time, I would demand upfront a lot more centralized support for the very boring parts of the work that we do, but that are critical, which is HR, finance, legal. We're a very young company at BuzzFeed, both in terms of the time we've been around and the people that work there. And we were very naive in saying, like, yeah, in 4 years we can launch 10 international editions and support them and like keep the people happy and feeling like they understand their jobs. That was, I think, I don't want to class it as a mistake, because I certainly don't want to say that I feel that we haven't done our utmost there. But I think we were not as prepared as we should have been going in, and I think we discounted the kind of support that we would really need to provide, and have been playing catch up on that piece a little bit ever since. I think that's one thing. I think also, if I could. It's not exactly going back, but as you mentioned, our industry is changing so rapidly. So when we first did our first round of launches, we kind of took what had worked in the US, a couple of years before that, and that was kind of our model to export. I wish we had, even at that point, been much more forward-thinking and flexible in the way that we were looking at building out our teams. And now, looking forward, I'm thinking a lot more about more flexible approaches. BuzzFeed now has a number of different brands. Could Tasty work in a market where we're not going to open BuzzFeed News? So, like, how can we be a little bit more flexible? Think a little bit more openly about partners as well. We've been very, we want to do this all ourselves. As I mentioned, we only have one joint venture. We don't have any licensing arrangements anywhere yet. And I think starting to be more open and look for partners in countries that we want to enter rather than do it on our own is something I'd change.
I think echoing what Scott was just saying, sometimes when you're launching something, you're focused on the launch so much you forget to look at what happens, 3 months, 6 months after. And I went into, we started really our international expansion in Editorial in 2015, and I went into Brazil, for instance, or pretty much everywhere I launched, I went with like one editor, and we were a very lean team, so started with one person. And like, shoot, the guy wants to go on vacation, or has a sick day, and like, what happens? So you just gotta, make sure that you're not just ready for the week that you launch or the month that you launch, but how do you keep things sustained, long term? And I'm lucky to have a really dedicated, brilliant team, but then I feel really, really sorry when they get a little tired, and and we don't have the things in place. So just making sure that you're thinking through the longer term as well, so that you have something that's sustainable, and obviously that you keep your people. And the other thing that that I would mention is when you're dealing with a digital product, it really helps to have a local product team. I don't know if you've experienced that at the World Service, but I've learned that there was never a digital product so smart that a special character can't break it. And it's sometimes, just...
Try building something for Sinhala, Burmese, and Telugu.
Yeah. See, I have it easy. It's mainly Latin alphabet. Chinese, I guess, would be the more complex that we have. But even an accent in French will break a URL, like in 2018, and that's really frustrating. And it's having, even if you have the most dedicated and interested, product team in California, if you don't use another language but English in your day-to-day life, like one thing that we recommend in the company, we tell all LinkedIn employees, or at least our international team, we tell LinkedIn employees, if you speak even just a little another language, switch your app to that language for a week and experience what your members are experiencing, right? I mean, in tech, we talk a lot about eating your own dog food. Super important to use your product as your international user experiencing it, and that's where you see, everything that's not working and things that are, of course. So, having product teams that are local, and now we have a product team in India, we have a product team in China. Our head of international product is actually based in Bangalore. And I love that, and I'd love to see more of that.
Thank you.
I think compared to you guys, our expansion, we have a new markets department centrally, and they look at licensee deals. We're launching in GQ Middle East in a few months. But we kind of did the reverse, so we had to build a central team to join up the operation. And I think two things I personally think were absolutely crucial. One is hiring. As you said before, it's not an English or American company expanding abroad. We hired a super international team. The more international, the better, because it's very much, there is no one preference or one language or one culture that's more important than the other. We work with China, Taiwan, Japan, Russia. It's crucial for us to have people in the team that not only speak the language but speak the same culture. So hiring is absolutely fundamental. And one thing I think has been a bit crucial, but also it's a difficult balance, is when you're a new team, you spend a lot of time listening because you have to learn about all the incredible talent there is in market and all the specialties and the unique voice of the brand in all the markets. At the same time, if you're lucky enough of having a company that's doing a big investment on central, there is only so much time. You say, oh, we're listening. At some point, you have to start delivering something. And so I think that balance between listening and learning and then put something in place, it's not always easy. Like, I wish sometime we had just more time. Our central and our editors centrally, they talk with all our editors. That's 11 calls. That's already a week. How do you put all of that in the mix?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I can relate to all of the things you said, because we three small things before we open up for questions. So out of the 15 people in my team, we have 13 nationalities, so that helps a lot. So people can cover the world like that. Second is that we outsourced our Google AMP development to Kenya. So because it's very hard for external developers to work on our proper BBC technical stack. So given the Google AMP is an external technology, so it was easier to outsource that sort of work. And finally is that exactly what you said, Fed, is this managerial tactics of tell, sell, yell doesn't work when you work like that, right? So enough for the time being. So we started later, so we need to finish a little bit early, but we have about 10 minutes for questions. So please.
Hi, I have two questions. One is for Scott Lamb. I would be interested in the partnerships you're going to seek and pursue. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And the other one is, do you observe, each of you, differences between the different communities you're building in the cultural contexts? And if yes, is that something that you and your teams cultivated differently, or is it because of the cultures that you are going into?
Great. On the first point, we're sort of in the early stages of that, so I don't have anything super specific to say. But again, our model has been very fixed in this one way of just owning and operating, and I think we're starting to look at other broader partnerships. I mean, as there is one recent example, we launched an arrangement with Toutiao in China, one of the largest media companies there. They have this massive newsreader app, and the deal was just to get BuzzFeed content onto that app. They're handling the translation and adaptation and publishing, and we get some data and insights. It was just China's a very difficult market to operate in, as I think everyone in the room knows. We wanted a very lightweight way for us to start sort of testing the waters there. So I think we'll look for things more like that down the road.
I guess in terms of culture, I think our culture is BBC guidelines. So we get the people and train them, spend a lot of time training them, and then the real work starts afterwards, right? When people like my team and others leave, and then they left there just doing their own stuff. So the baseline is BBC guidelines and the way BBC does things. But of course, Korean service will be different from Russian. Russian will be different from BBC Mundo, for a Latin American one. But what unites them all is I guess, commitment to providing, extra value, added value to the markets we operate, based on the independence and unbiased news.
Hi, I'm Mira Selva from the Reuters Institute. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. Can I ask you a little bit about content in all of these countries? There's two things about this. Firstly, how important is it for your various organizations to maintain a voice? I mean, the BBC is the archetype, there is a voice, there's standards, there's quality control, but also a British voice in a way that comes across. How important is it for all of you to maintain a single voice? And the second thing is about different legal frameworks for, libel laws, censorship. Do you build that in centrally? Do you work as you go along? How do you deal with the different regulatory environments for content?
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please, and all actually,
Okay,
because it's interesting that you've got the large organisations for whom there's huge reputational cost, and then new ones that are going into fields for the first time.
So we're actually trying to get far away from something which used to be called a British BBC voice. So that doesn't work anymore. I think all our audience research shows around that BBC has a very trusted perception around the world. We are the most trusted news organization in the world, but we also come across as being a little bit like an old English gentleman in a bowler hat. And we're trying very, very hard to get rid of that. And by hiring people I remember the times when I started for the BBC, and we used to have the same radio bulletin for all language services. And I remember writing 3 stories about DRC, irrespective whether our audience was interested in that, because it was in the top of BBC News. Currently, as I said, it's central available material, regional content, and individual content produced in the market in that sort of mix. So every service will have their own language, but again, based on the BBC standards?
I guess for us is kind of the same in the sense that brand is, and the voice of the brand is everything, especially when you have such established brand like Vogue, for example. So that said, despite being a Vogue voice on a Vogue brand, how that is declined in local markets is kind of different. And they all have their voice, and Editorial is based in market, so absolutely is local. And similarly, everything about laws, because the content is produced mainly in market, is they deal with it locally.
Yeah, I think probably the case for all of us here. We work for pretty strong, identifiable brands, so we definitely, for us, have a LinkedIn editorial voice. You know, for the content that is written by our own editors. I think the Daily Rundown for us would be the best example. We've kind of it's gone through, you know, started writing it back in 2013. It's gone through so many iterations. We've kind of figured out what it's supposed to look like, what it's supposed to sound like, and that gets replicated across all of our different geos. Though writing an insightful summary of news with a little bit of analysis in 80 words is a lot easier in English than it is in French, which takes about 40% more words, or German. So those are things, you know, it might sound silly, but when you have a character limit on a headline of like 35 characters, I kid you not, and you're trying to write in German, it's really hard. So yes, there is definitely a sense of a voice that we replicate. And then actually there was a second half, I think, to your question, which
considerations.
Yeah, I mean that we operate within the terms of service of the platform, which are international and within the laws of the particular markets that we operate in.
Let's take one last question, please.
Hello. What's the balance between translating and adapting text and producing direct content and producing directly content in the local language? I mean, this is not a question probably for BBC, but for the other three.
It varies market by market. You know, we do kind of leave that decision in the hands of the local editors, but I will say, you know, I think initially, when we launched in non-English languages at BuzzFeed, it was all translation and adaptation, and we thought, oh, maybe this is a very easy way to grow and invest. You know, it's a very low-risk approach. Certainly, not only our readership, but our understanding of like the impact that we're having on local markets just grew astronomically once we invested in hiring local writers who are making content from the start to reach readers in those countries. I think, you know, our mix varies somewhere between, I would say, probably on the 60 to 70% local, you know, 40 to 30% translation, but it really depends. And we've been sort of surprised in some markets we've launched later. We're very focused on original content, and they sort of later got into translation and adaptation, and it was a huge source of traffic for them and really worked very, very well, and we were surprised by that. Japan is an example where we were like, nah, translation's not gonna work here. The cultural gap is much too wide, and it came late to actually be a huge part of their publishing.
I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? So in my previous professional life, I worked at Le Figaro in Paris, and I was in charge of this New York Times International Weekly, which was a selection of New York Times article. We translated into French, published it. So the goal there was essentially, it was readers in French wanting to see how Americans saw the world. And therefore, it made sense to have that content in translation. At LinkedIn, we've tried a little translation. I personally don't find tons of value in it because translating alone is not enough. You need to adapt. You need to explain concepts, you know, that things that seem extremely obvious to a French audience, like, you know, how labor relations work in our country. If you have a foreign reader, you have to just explain it all from scratch. So you might as well just write a different article, because translating alone just doesn't really work for a different audience. So personally, I never found it to be the best use of our resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, as I mentioned before, the central team produces some content, Vogue being a very visual brand, that's easy because you don't have to translate images. However, for example, like with Instagram, the content produced centrally gets to the markets as a package of assets, and they can choose in what way to use the content and what kind of regional angle to put on it. And in other ways is inspiration. Sometimes translation, but sometimes an idea that could resonate. You know, going especially for the fashion content. Well, we cover so many different zones that you know, if it's summer in a place, might not be summer in the same place. It varies so much. And sometimes just inspiration.
Right. Okay. So we've got to close, and first of all, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. First of all, in the International Journalism Festival, we've got to appreciate the fact that the future of internet is not in English, right? So we just need to appreciate that 21st century is not going to be about internet in English. So I have changed my point of view. Not only I have the best job in journalism, but the other three panelists also have the best job in journalism. So this is the place to be. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the panel. Thank you.